Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Today, we are looking at Chapter 10, Section 1, A Republican Takes Office. And this whole lesson is going to be about Thomas Jefferson as the third president and some of the things that he did to kind of help to define what a president can and cannot do. And you can see that in our essential question for today. It says, how and why did Thomas Jefferson try to reduce the role of the federal government? We know that Jefferson, as a Democratic Republican, had a very democratic way of approaching his entire life. So we're going to see that in the way that he approached his life, as well as the way that he approached his presidency. Now, as you can also see, I've already done audio recordings for this lesson, so if you prefer to use that, you're more than welcome. Otherwise, let's move on and take a look at some of our key terms that we'll be discussing today. All right, our key terms for today are democratic, laissez-faire, which is a French term that just means let alone, and we'll talk about that. Free market, Marbury versus Madison, which is a very important Supreme Court case, which established judicial review, and those are the things that we'll be talking about at the end of our lesson today. All right, so let's get into things. Hello again. This is a picture of our good friend and third president of the United States, Mr. Thomas Jefferson. Now, Jefferson's inauguration, and if you remember, inauguration is it's the ceremony in which a president is sworn in and actually takes the oath of office to become the president. So Jefferson's inauguration as president was not very glorious. He really prided himself on being a man of the people and believed that he was placed in a position as president to work for the common man. So our first video is actually going to show how even his inauguration was an example of his personal democratic style. And he would take this personal belief in democracy into the presidency. So we're going to watch this first video entitled Inauguration Day, and then we will pick back up talking a little bit more about Mr. Thomas Jefferson.
Just before noon on March 4th, 1801, Thomas Jefferson, a month shy of his 58th birthday, strolled into the Senate chamber, the only part of the brand new Capitol building to have been completed, to take the oath as president. Feelings against Jefferson among the displaced Federalists still ran high. A bitter John Adams had appointed federal judges sure to oppose everything Jefferson wanted, and then left town at dawn rather than take part in the inauguration of the man who had once been his friend. Jefferson had stayed the previous night at a boarding house, wore a plain suit and shoes that tied, because he considered buckles undemocratic, and he insisted on walking, not riding, to his inaugural. The principle of society with us, Jefferson explained, is the equal rights of all. Nobody shall be above you, nor you above anybody. Pell-mell is our law.
Jefferson's complete absence of pomp, when combined with a great sense, I'm sure, of dignity, was a statement of Republican, small r, Republican simplicity, Republican virtue, Republican, not meant unpleasantly, severity.
The tone of Jefferson's address was conciliatory, although he spoke so softly that many in the chamber did not fully understand him until they read his words in the newspaper.
Let us then, fellow citizens, unite with one heart and one mind. Let us restore to social intercourse that harmony and affection, without which liberty and even life itself are but dreary things. Every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists. If there be any among us who would wish to dissolve this union, or to change its Republican form, let them stand undisturbed as monuments of the safety with which error of opinion may be tolerated, where reason is left free to combat it.
The changes of administration, which in every government and every age have most generally been epochs of confusion, villainy, and bloodshed, in this, our happy country, take place without any species of distraction or disorder. This day has one of the most worthy men taken that seat to which he was called by the voice of his country. Margaret Bayard Smith.
And we're back. Now, this is a painting of Jefferson's home, Monticello, which he actually designed, by the way. He was a man of very, very many talents. And when it came to the government and came to the presidency, Jefferson was really determined to make the United States more democratic. In other words, he wanted to make sure that the government ensured that all people had the same rights. And he held to a very strong belief that all citizens in a democracy should be able to play their own part. Now, even though he came from a very wealthy family, he believed that the strength of the American nation came from the common people, the farmers, the merchants, and so on and so on. And in his own personal life, he was very informal. When he was inaugurated as president, as we saw in the video, he chose to walk to the Capitol rather than to take a carriage. He preferred very quiet dinners to large, grand, formal parties. He also chose to wear much more casual clothes and would shake hands with people rather than bow to them. He purposely tried to show that the president was not a king, was not a monarch. He was just an ordinary citizen that had been chosen for a very important job. Remember, one of the fears of the Anti-Federalists and of the Democratic Republicans was that the president would gain too much power and eventually become a dictator. So Jefferson really made it a point to downplay his social status and emphasize that he was a citizen doing a job, a very important job, but a job nonetheless. Now, some Federalists were worried about Jefferson's democratic ideals, specifically his support of the French Revolution and his very open and vocal displeasure with the Alien and Sedition Acts. They were afraid that Jefferson would try to bring about some of the same kinds of changes in the United States that were coming about in France, and that he would punish Federalists that had used the Alien and Sedition Acts to put Republicans in jail. And our next video is going to talk a little bit more about this Second American Revolution.
The man who had fought all his life against the principle of centralized power was now his country's chief executive. Jefferson moved into the president's house and declared it big enough for 2 emperors, 1 pope, and the Grand Lama in the bargain. He did all he could to end any confusion between presidents and kings. He barred the use of his face on coins, forbade any official celebration of his birthday, and threw open the doors of the executive mansion to anyone who wanted to see him.
In a few moments after our arrival, a tall, high-boned man came into the room. He was dressed, or rather undressed, in an old brown coat, red waistcoat, old corduroy small clothes, much soiled, woolen hose and slippers without heels. I thought him a servant, when General Varnum surprised me by announcing that it was the President, Senator William Plummer.
Jefferson acted quickly to undo what he considered the excesses of his predecessor. He pardoned everyone locked up under the Sedition Act, returned monies paid in fines, even wrote letters of apology on behalf of the government. He cut spending, shrank the Navy, abolished federal jobs he thought unnecessary, and battled stubbornly with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, his cousin John Marshall, over whose vision of the Constitution would prevail.
He came to power in what he called the Second American Revolution, and people wondered whether he would actually recreate the nation on a much more democratic line than his predecessors had been comfortable with. In fact, Jefferson was a very moderate president. He didn't alter the foundations of the Hamiltonian system. He merely attempted to put it on a Republican tack.
A noiseless course, not meddling in the affairs of others, is a mark that society is going on in happiness. If we can prevent the government from wasting the labors of the people under the pretext of taking care of them, they must be happy. Thomas Jefferson.
Now, the Federalists were afraid that Jefferson was going to punish them, but really, he didn't have any major plans of pulling back from a lot of the programs and policies that the Federalists had put in place. But he did believe that the federal government was getting too large and too powerful. He also wanted to try and bring an end to a lot of the political arguments of the previous years by promising that even though the Federalists had the minority in Congress, they would still have a voice, and that as a minority, they still possessed equal rights, which goes back to his belief that everyone should have a say in a democracy. And when it comes to Jefferson's presidency, he had two goals for himself. Well, not just two goals, but they kind of were two main components. One was to reduce the size of the federal government, and two, he wanted to reconcile party differences. So, reducing the federal government, he wanted to cut the federal budget and reduce the national debt. In doing so, promote laissez-faire economic policies, decrease the size and number of government departments, and reduce the size of the Army and Navy with Congress's permission, as well as asking Congress to repeal the whiskey tax. So he wanted to reduce the size of the federal government, but also reconcile the party differences. And one of the ways he did that was retaining the Bank of the United States, continuing to pay off state debts using federal money, which was a policy that had been promoted by the Federalists, and allow many Federalists to keep their government jobs. So the two major components of his goals for himself as president: reduce the size of the federal government and reconcile the party differences. And our next video is going to talk about that in a little bit more detail.
Just before Jefferson takes office, the lame duck Congress reduces the number of justices on the Supreme Court by 1 and expands the number of federal judgeships. Adams takes advantage of his last days as president to appoint a number of Federalists to these new posts.
Adams, of course, felt that he had been unfairly defeated. In fact, he had just before the campaign done one of the greatest statesmanlike acts of his presidency.
Meanwhile, Hamilton badly divided the Federalist Party. He wrote a scurrilous attack on Adams that was widely circulated within the political elite. And in effect, the Federalist Party as a party committed suicide in 1800.
Despite lingering resentments about the election of 1800, the transfer of power from Adams to Jefferson is relatively peaceful.
Obviously, the power was transferred from Washington to Adams, but they belonged to the same party. Transferring power to a different party when you hated the incumbent in that party, that was quite a remarkable thing. I think a lot of people began to breathe a little more easily about whether this could work.
What really happened in 1801 when Jefferson came to power, many historians would argue to you that nothing really happened, that Jefferson didn't do all the things that he might have done in dismantling the system that Hamilton and the Federalists had created.
If you look at Jefferson's first inaugural address, he attempted, at least, to build a coalition. The famous line, "We are all Federalists, we are all Republicans." He didn't set out to destroy, as the Federalists had been afraid, the entire financial system that Hamilton had put in place.
But he did eschew direct taxes, like the direct tax of 1798, taxes, excises, and so forth that had led to the Whiskey Rebellion earlier, and put the American government solely on the basis of the income from the tariff. Jefferson also paid down the debt by 50% or more. This was something that, of course, was anathema to Hamilton. Jefferson wanted the debt ultimately to go away, precisely for the reasons Hamilton wanted to keep it. All the tendencies towards centralization that had built up during the Federalist administrations and had also been encouraged by the quasi-war with France, all of those were suddenly relaxed. And as I suggested, there is a kind of a devolution of authority, and that is, it's the states became the center of action. The central government was less intrusive and less powerful under Jefferson.
And yet that doesn't stop people from looking for federal help.
He was, of course, the subject, the victim, the recipient of numerous letters from people who wrote for jobs. They're wonderfully funny, formulaic letters. Dear President Jefferson, I do not presume to know you, but I have been a loyal Jefferson and suffered grievously at the hands of the Federalists in my town. I hope that you will have a small office in the Customs House or the Post Office for which you will see fit to appoint me. And he did, in fact, remove a number of Federalists from offices to put in Jeffersonian Republicans. Nonetheless, I think during that first term, the Federalists were very much relieved that everything they had stood for had not been dismantled.
New economic policies. So first, Jefferson wanted to try and reduce the federal budget and called on this man, his Secretary of the Treasury, Albert Gallatin, to help. Now, Gallatin was indeed able to reduce federal spending through careful management, and even though he looks kind of scary, Gallatin was actually a bit of a financial wizard and really was able to help Jefferson reduce federal spending. Jefferson believed in what is known as laissez-faire, a laissez-faire approach to economics. Now, laissez-faire is a French term that means let alone, and it implies that the government does its best not to interfere with the economy. So this approach was promoted by a Scottish economist named Adam Smith in his book, The Wealth of Nations. Smith believed in a free market where goods and services are exchanged with little to no government regulation. Competition would drive the success of the market and would end up benefiting everybody, not just the wealthy. This approach was very different to the one held by the Federalists. They believed that the government should try and promote trade and manufacturing, but Jefferson, just like Kermit here, believed that it was the market, not the government, that should drive trade and manufacturing, because he believed that that's literally none of the government's business. The government should stay out of business, hence Kermit. And this approach has come to be known as capitalism, and a modified form of it is still the economic approach of the United States today. And our next video is going to talk a little bit more about the origin of free market economies and the differences between free market and command economies, which I think is a good thing for us to learn a little bit about, since we're talking about the growing American economy when it was still very young. So I'm going to watch that video, and then I will see you in just a moment.
Free market economies are based on private ownership. Individuals are free to own businesses and invest capital as they wish. At the other end of the spectrum, command economies are controlled by governing entities. The government owns or controls the means of production. Individuals only serve as laborers and consumers.
Of course, these are just theories.
Throughout history, philosophers and economic theorists observed social, political, and economic conditions.
They came up with ideas hoping to correct problems in current economic systems.
Adam Smith is credited with designing modern capitalist theory. Smith was an economist and philosopher in Scotland in the 1700s. At that time, Europe's major nations competed under the mercantile system. Governments controlled much of the land and resources. In order to build their national wealth, they regulated their economies to make sure exports outnumbered imports. They collected high taxes or tariffs on imported goods. This system was good for national governments, but the common worker or business owner had little control of their own affairs. By the mid-1700s, European laborers became frustrated with this system. A group of French economists called physiocrats urged governments to stop interfering in foreign trade. They called their policy laissez-faire, which means hands off.
Adam Smith agreed with the physiocrats. In order to stimulate an economy, government involvement in commerce must be severely limited.
In 1776, he published An Inquiry into the Nature and Cause of the Wealth of Nations. The book was a big hit. Smith claimed that nations would become wealthy only when its citizens were free to pursue their own interests. In serving themselves, he said, people will best serve society.
Smith's work established the conditions or freedoms that are necessary for a capitalist system to operate. These conditions are still true today.
With the freedom to own property, individual capitalists and entrepreneurs own the shops and factories and make decisions about what to produce and how much. These decisions are directed by the laws of supply and demand rather than government controls. The freedom to make a profit motivates business owners to produce or supply what consumers demand. Business owners are also free to compete with each other for customers. Competition motivates producers to improve quality and efficiency of production, so they can offer better products at cheaper prices and still make a profit. On the other side of the equation, consumers have the freedom to spend their money as they wish. They can shop around for the best deals, which forces business owners to be competitive. And finally, laborers are able to choose where they want to work as long as they are qualified. Supply and demand operates the same for labor as it does for products. Workers needing jobs will train for the skills that are in demand. In theory, as long as all of these freedoms are protected, the elements of a capitalist economic system would balance out naturally. Smith called this principle the invisible hand. As long as citizens were left to pursue their own goals, they would achieve economic harmony.
So above all, Jefferson believed that the government existed to protect the rights of citizens. And other than protecting those rights, Jefferson believed that the government should just back off and let people live their lives. He cut the federal budget, removed different federal departments, and with the approval of Congress, reduced the size of the Army and the Navy. And specifically, we've talked about this in Chapter 9, but he despised the Sedition Act. And the Sedition Act, this is a cartoon from that time period that shows the Sedition Act as being a monster that's going to devour human rights, honest opinion, free speech, and the free press. And he just absolutely hated the Sedition Act, and fortunately it actually expired before he took office. So when he took office, he pardoned anybody that had been put in prison because of violating the Sedition Act. He also asked Congress to reduce the citizenship requirements for immigrants from 14 years, which is what it had been bumped up to with the Alien Acts, back down to 5 years, which is what they were originally. So he did what he could to balance the federal budget as well as reduce the size and role of the federal government.
Whereas the Alien Act targeted foreigners, the Sedition Act targeted U.S. citizens. The Sedition Act made it a crime for American citizens to write, say, or print anything false, scandalous, and malicious about the government, the Congress, or the President.
It was probably, a lot of people felt an out-and-out violation of the First Amendment because it curtailed both freedom of speech and freedom to print criticisms.
So this is the early toddling stages of American political discourse. And at this point, they hadn't gotten the idea that you could have a robust and legitimate criticism of the government without endangering the government with anarchy or civil war.
Now, President Jefferson, future President Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson, and the Republicans, who were the primary opponents of the Federalists in those days, loathed the Alien and Sedition Acts. They thought they were an outrage and an abomination and a violation of the Constitution of the United States. But of course, they weren't in power yet, and so during Adams' administration, the Alien and Sedition Acts were passed and applied.
There were about 15 indictments brought in the federal courts for violation of the Sedition Act. Remember, this was the one that said you couldn't criticize the government. And so they singled out certain of these prominent editors, and the federal government did indict them for a violation of this act. There were, I think, 10 convictions, and some people actually went to jail. Matthew Lyons was a famous case up in Vermont. He spent, 4 months in jail for what we would consider today, I think, fairly modest criticism of President Adams.
So, first things first, he wanted to reduce the size and role of the federal government. But the second major component of what he wanted to accomplish as president was to try and heal the differences in the arguments between the two political parties. So to try and do so, he chose to let many Federalists keep their political jobs. He also kept a few of the programs that the Federalists had put in place, like, for instance, the Bank of the United States, and using federal money to pay off state debts. Jefferson ultimately wanted to fully pay off the debt, but he was unable to do so, and future wars and economic downturns caused the debt to grow and decrease and slowly grow over time and continue through the present day. And just in case you were wondering, this is the first bank as it looks today, still located in wonderful Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about today is strengthening the Supreme Court. And this isn't something that Jefferson did, but it's something that was going on early in his presidency. When Jefferson was sworn in, by 1800, the one place that Federalists were still very strong in government was in the court system. We had a Republican president, a Republican-controlled Congress, but there was still a large Federalist voice in the court system. And there was a gap of a few months between Jefferson's election and his inauguration as president. So during this time, Congress first passed laws to increase the number of federal judges in order to put Federalists in those positions. And in a little over 2 weeks before Jefferson was sworn in, President Adams filled as many of the positions as he could in the circuit courts with Federalists. Basically, Adams tried to do what he could to ensure that even though he was leaving, the courts would kind of keep his legacy going and block anything that Jefferson would try to do. Not the nicest maneuver. And one of the judges that President Adams appointed before he was out of office is this man, Chief Justice John Marshall. Now, Marshall was similar to Jefferson in that he was a wealthy and very, very brilliant Virginia farmer, but that's really where the similarities end. Marshall was a very strong, staunch Federalist, and he believed that a strong federal government was necessary, and actually wanted to make the federal government stronger than it already was. And he believed that of all the branches of government, the judicial branch did not have nearly enough power and did not have nearly the amount of power of the other two branches. So he took it upon himself really to define and strengthen the power of the courts. Now, remember how just a minute ago I talked about Adams putting all these people into different appointments for the courts. So Chief Justice John Marshall wants the opportunity to try and strengthen the court system, and he got his chance to increase the power of the Supreme Court in the 1803 case between William Marbury and James Madison, or as it's come to be known, Marbury versus Madison. William Marbury had been appointed by John Adams on his last night as president, but Republicans refused to accept his appointment because they felt that it was an unfair and really just a mean, devious act to try and pack the courts with Federalists. So Jefferson's response was to order the Secretary of State, Mr. James Madison, not to deliver the official papers of appointment to Mr. Marbury, which would have confirmed him as a member of the court system. So Jefferson just says, no, I'm not going to do this, so Madison, don't even take him the papers. So Marbury sued James Madison, and according to the Judiciary Act of 1789, the case would be decided by the Supreme Court because it involved elected officials. The Supreme Court ruled against Marbury in this decision, and in the decision, Chief Justice Marshall declared that the Judiciary Act was unconstitutional. Remember that that's the major check that the Supreme Court has against the other two branches, is determining whether or not laws are unconstitutional. Well, he determined that the Judiciary Act of 1789 was unconstitutional. He argued that the Constitution did not give the Supreme Court the right to decide cases brought against federal officials, and Congress could not give the court that power simply by passing the Judiciary Act. So the Supreme Court's decision in this case set the very, very important precedent, there's that word again, known as judicial review. And judicial review gives the Supreme Court the power to decide whether laws passed by Congress were constitutional, and the power to reject laws that it deems to be unconstitutional. And judicial review remains to this day as probably the most important power of the Supreme Court, if not one of the most. In my opinion, it is the most important power of the Supreme Court. And our final video is going to talk about kind of the ins and outs of the Marbury versus Madison case and the results.
The last-minute appointments by the Adams administration, however, do set the stage for the emergence of a stronger judiciary under the leadership of John Marshall.
When the Jeffersonians were elected in 1800, one of their primary concerns was weakening the federal judiciary because they didn't want the federal courts to be telling the states what to do. So when the Federalists were in lame duck session after the 1800 election, they not only put in lots of new judges, but changed the structure of the judiciary. So that it was much more extensive, could reach down further into the states. The Jeffersonians came into power. They repealed the act that the Federalists had passed, and then they tried to impeach some judges. One of them they impeached who was an alcoholic, who had outrageous behavior on the court. The other was a Supreme Court justice who was such a partisan Federalist that he would go around making inflamed speeches about how terrible Jefferson was. Now, that member of the Supreme Court, he was not removed from the bench, so a very high barrier was created. But there was constant battle over the state of the courts. In the most famous case of all Supreme Court cases, probably Marbury versus Madison.
Marbury versus Madison involved a suit by Mr. Marbury who had been appointed to office. The commission had been signed, but Jefferson had refused to have it delivered. Madison would have been the person delivering it as the Secretary of State. So the case, Marbury versus Madison, was Marbury trying to get his position. The Marshall Court ruled that no, he could not have the commission because part of the Judiciary Act of 1789 had in fact been beyond the powers of the Congress. So in a case which was really very minor, and in a case which denied what the plaintiff was seeking, Marshall expanded the dominion of the judiciary and really established the principle of judicial review.
Jefferson does not repeat Adams' mistakes in selecting a cabinet or in relating to Congress.
Jefferson had two brilliant colleagues on which to call for his cabinet, right off the bat. Albert Gallatin, who was born in Geneva, who had lived in western Pennsylvania, was a brilliant financier, had been in the House of Representatives in the 1790s, and he really carried the banner for the Jeffersonian Republicans. And they shared the same aims, which were cut taxes, reduce the deficit, which they did, they cut it out, and reduce the Army and the Navy. For Secretary of State, the obvious choice was James Madison, who was Jefferson's younger partner, if we want to call him that. They had worked together in Virginia politics at the national level, and Madison was simply the shrewdest, the most loyal, and also could disagree with Jefferson. So he would be a perfect Secretary of the State.
Jefferson was also, in his first administration, a master manager of the Republican Congress, because his partisans had now dominated both houses. And he did brilliantly in managing legislation and so forth. Certainly the tendencies were ones that fit Jefferson's personality. They were conservative. He didn't want to rock the boat too much. Yet the tendency was toward the mitigation or limitation of federal power.
On the one hand, he was a radical idealist. On the other hand, he was a tough politician, and a very able politician, and a kind of ruthless politician, and an excellent administrator. He was probably the best administrator as president up to Lincoln. He was, and this was well known, he managed the executive branch extremely well. He developed relations with the cabinet in a subtle way. He was an excellent party politician, and at the same time, he was a radical idealist. And the result of this is, he is a person to whom people react to in very different ways, and his reputation keeps shifting all the time, because people see him either as this hypocrite because of this, or as a successful operator despite his ideals. It's very hard to reconcile this, and it was true in his own time.
The two men who occupy the office of the presidency from 1796 to 1808 represent different styles and personalities, certainly, but also different points of view.
Which brings us to the assignment for today. Now, since today's lesson was a little bit longer than usual, there's no written assignment, but I want you to go back and review, skim through or read Chapter 10, Section 1, and also take a look ahead at Section 2 in preparation for tomorrow's lesson. Now remember, from today, we talked about Jefferson's presidential goals to reduce the size of the federal government and reconcile party differences, and how he went about trying to achieve those goals, as well as the very, very important Supreme Court case of William Marbury versus James Madison. All right, and with that, I want to thank you for watching today's video and going through the lesson with me, and I will see you tomorrow. Have a great day.